So first I'd like to introduce Subhankar Banerjee. Subhankar is an Indian-born American photographer, writer, educator, and activist. Originally having studied engineering, physics, and computer science, he left his career in 2000 to begin a large-scale photography project in the American Arctic, which culminated in the book Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, Seasons of Life and Land. Over the past decade, he's been a leading international voice on issues of Arctic conservation, indigenous human rights, resource development, and climate change. He's a regular contributor to the Huffington Post and is currently the director's visitor at Princeton's Institute for Advanced Study this fall. Banerjee received the inaugural Cultural Freedom Fellowship from the Lannan Foundation and the inaugural Greenleaf Artist Award from the United Nations Environment Program. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. First of all, a huge, huge salute to Anne Wolf. What she has done here is remarkable, and the whole team, I really would like to congratulate and express my gratitude and thanks. Since arriving here, I have seen many dear friends who are here. First of all, I'm on the panel with my dearest friend, Chris Jordan. So that's really wonderful, and many friends in the audience. And that is a good thing, because I'm hoping that my friends would help me out, pay for my meals while I'm here. Because all the money that I brought with me, I already spent gambling in the El Dorado Casino. And while I was really trying to focus on winning, I lost all my ideas too. So right now, both my wallet and my brain are rather empty. So I'll try to be somewhat boring by reading from my notes. And that's the only thing I can do. I am, like Anne mentioned, I am primarily an activist. So when I get to speak in front of the art audience, I like to say a few things here and there about the medium in which I work, which is photography. So I'll say a few things, share some ideas, and then we'll see a few pictures, and that'll be that. And I promise to finish before 15 minutes. Edward Steichen, former director of photography at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, once commented, quote, "The mission of photography is to explain man to man and each man to himself. And that is the most complicated thing on earth," unquote. After we make that sentence gender inclusive, I would note 2 points in Steichen's statements. One is that he was talking about relations in photography of the human world, and that relations in photography is a difficult thing. It seems to me the art institutions, museums, as well as the MFA Inc. have followed Steichen's vision faithfully ever since. Now let us imagine this scenario. A group of aliens decide to visit the photography galleries in some of our venerable art institutions. At the end of their visit, they would conclude that the only species that moves and alive on Earth is a species called Homo sapiens. And that is sad. It seems to me what we need now, perhaps, is a scream in the spirit of Linda Nochlin and raise the question, where are all the great photographs of the non-human world? Birds and animals. This institution seems like an exception, because here right now, along with Altered Landscape, you will see an amazing exhibition, small exhibition of the work of French photographer Jean-Luc Millen, curated by a dear friend, Christy Matsuera Davis from Lannan Foundation. I hope you will get to see that exhibit also. I'm not talking about animals as objects or their actions as moments, even decisive moments. I am instead talking about, let's see, is it possible? Okay. I am instead talking about relations, the relations that exist in the non-human world and the relations we humans make with that world. And that is the central question I have been attempting to explore for the past 11 years. To get there, though, I must move away from some of the dominant practices of photography of the past 5 decades. Objectivity, neutrality of observation, distance. Those practices are akin to science. I would look toward humanities instead. But why raise the question? The health of our planet is in a great crisis. The life support system of our Earth is slipping away from underneath our feet. And we saw really humbling and mind-blowing presentation from Edward Burtynsky, who showed the other side of the destruction it's taking place right now, and it's ongoing for a long, long time. One species, that's us, humans, are wiping out other species at an unprecedented rate. Species are going extinct, falling away from our Earth like autumn leaves fall away from trees. We are taking away their home and their food. Photography did engage with the unprecedented human tragedies of the 20th century, but the ecological tragedies of the 21st century unfolding before our collective eyes are of orders of magnitude larger. And photography has an opportunity to engage in this moment of crisis instead of objectivity with subjectivity, instead of distance with closeness, instead of neutrality with opinions, instead of cynicism with empathy. I have only 2 projects. The Arctic series began in 2000 and is ongoing, and the Desert series began in 2006 and ended in 2010. Both series address 2 simple things: home and food that land provides to humans and to all other species with whom we share this earth. I call it land as home. In the Arctic, I looked at the far, and in the desert, it was the near, just 5 miles around the home I lived for 5 years in New Mexico. For me, there is no idea in the beginning, just a desire. If we could pull out the image, what do I have to do? Oh, thank you. Okay, and then I can.
Yeah, just.
For me, there is no idea in the beginning, just a desire. Both the Arctic and the Desert series began with photographs of death that I took. In the Arctic, it was a photograph of one polar bear eating another. And the right key? Okay. And in the desert, it was a photograph of a dead bird. Death resulted in desire. In the Arctic, it was a desire to live with polar bears in the wild. And in the desert, it was a desire to know where I live. I began. Then a combination of lived experience and thought, each informing the other and evolving in an intertwined manner, eventually helps me to define a conceptual framework in which I work. But it is the lived experience that is essential part of my creative process. The brief time that I have here, I'll talk only about the Arctic, and in that, only about caribou and people, and a few motifs. So far in the Arctic, I have been working with 3 motifs that have evolved over the years. The first is color, not as a medium, but as a motif. It is a political choice. In the popular conception around the world, Arctic is primarily thought to be a land of snow and ice and snow. And in the words of pro-development US politicians, the Arctic has been variously described as, quote, flat, white nothingness, unquote, quote, frozen wasteland of snow and ice, unquote, quote, barren wasteland. And in prominent TV programs like 60 Minutes, while introducing the seed bank place in Svalbard that one of our speakers spoke about early in the morning, the Arctic was described as, quote, hostile wasteland, unquote. I began to ask such questions as, can I make a photograph with white, blue, and brown? With green and blue? Color, I thought, would be a wonderful visual language to help us unlearn some of these intolerances. The next two motifs dealt with aesthetic ideas of natural and cultural ecologies and ethics. Instead of focusing on all kinds of wildlife, I have been focusing on only 4 things: caribou, birds, whales, and fish. My main interest lies in the ideas of local, regional, and global interconnectedness. This was a political choice as well, as Arctic is thought to be a land remote and disconnected from our lives. On the contrary, hundreds of millions of birds migrate to the Arctic each spring from every corner of the Earth for nesting and rearing their young, a planetary celebration of global interconnectedness. On the other hand, caribou, whales, and fish migrate hundreds and sometimes thousands of miles, connecting up numerous indigenous communities through subsistence food harvest, local and regional connectedness. In my cultural ecology photographs, I have chosen the bent posture as my primary motif, another political choice. In a post-domestic society that we live in, the bent posture, a symbol of labor, has mostly disappeared from our visual consciousness. We primarily sit down. We sit in the morning, drink tea, coffee. We sit down and drive or take public transport to get to our workplace. We sit down in the office. We sit down in the chairs to listen to a conference. We return home and sit down, eat or watch TV, and we go to sleep. The disappearance of the bent posture from our visual consciousness may have led to various forms of intolerances. I work closely with indigenous human rights and environmental organizations for protection of significant ecocultural regions in the Arctic from destructive resource development projects, including oil, coal, gas, and minerals. It's sort of the other side of something Edward Burtynsky was presenting. My focus is more in the resistance movement. We seem to have resource wars everywhere in the Arctic now, and Arctic Alaska is no exception. In fact, the resource wars over there are the most intense. Just so it happens, Arctic Alaska reside in the most biologically diverse quadrant of the entire circumpolar north. Also, unsurprisingly, global warming's most severe impacts are happening in the polar regions. Now, I am a storyteller, so I'll share just a few quick stories and few images. Finally, the images. I'm sure you're waiting, but not too many. The coastal plain of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in Alaska is the core calving area of the Porcupine River caribou herd, numbering around 160,000 animals now. In April, the pregnant females, there is not even a single male or non-pregnant female in that bunch, the pregnant females begin an extremely arduous journey and long journey, actually one of the longest terrestrial migrations on the planet, over frozen rivers, which is what you're looking at, and high mountains to reach the coastal plain in time for calving. The Gwich'in people of Alaska, northern Yukon, and Northwest Territories in Canada live on or near the migratory route of this herd. They have relied upon the caribou for over 10,000 years to meet their subsistence. That's my friend Charlie Sweeney, and I'll go through 4 images. To meet their subsistence as well as cultural and spiritual needs. They call the calving ground of the caribou Itzigwatsan Gwandai Godli, which roughly translates to the sacred place where life begins. The Arctic Refuge coastal plain is also the most debated public land in the US history. Whether to open up this area to oil and gas or preserve it permanently has been raging in the halls of US Congress for over 5 decades. Am I almost done? About a minute? Okay. So let me quickly just focus on a couple of installations. What I'm interested in is in the tension. And here, this was an exhibition curated by Lucy Lippard at the Boulder Museum of Contemporary Art in 2007. There are 3 tensions I was hoping for. One is, of course, of scale. To see the large caribou image, we pull back. To see the smaller hunting photographs, we get close to it. And then there is a tension of emotion. most Americans are attracted to. That is repulsive, to look at blood and gore. And the third is more dealing with history. This is what we want to preserve, but that comes in the way. And that kind of goes on. But very quickly, I'll just, and kind of there are all these tensions. I'll push through. Well, I don't have the time, so I was going to get into a little bit of the politics, but let me just move through the image that is here. So this image has been placed in the scars section of the book, but I am less interested in just the scar. This is, again, an image of relation and tension. When you see the print, it's mostly filled with tracks of caribou. On top is overlaid this. This became a very controversial image, and that's where the title comes from, Known and Unknown Tracks. To the oil company people, the big, bold tracks are known, but to the conservation and indigenous communities, these tracks were not known because no one should have had any permit to make those tracks there. And the opposite is true. For the conservation groups, the caribou tracks are known, but not these tracks. Or the oil companies, the opposite. They know these tracks, but not those, because in the winter, when they make these tracks, they won't see the caribou tracks. So that's where the ambiguity of the title comes in. But this caribou herd, you see that, this is the Central Arctic. This is a different herd, actually Tashapak Lake. They are dying in large number all across the north because of climate change. Without going into the details, and quickly want to say something about the coal. This is in the coal country, another caribou herd in Arctic Alaska. They used to be about 500,000 strong, but with climate change now about 377,000. But right where they give birth is the largest coal deposit of North America. And if I tell you that just right here, there is enough coal to fuel the United States' current need of coal for 3,500 years, you might be joking. But yes, we do have coal for 3,500 years, just from there. And this is what we are doing to Arctic Alaska, while in the lower 48 states. In ecology, we are talking about rewilding, connecting up fragmented ecospaces, from Yellowstone to Yukon, or from Bering, Baja, to the Bering. In the Arctic, we are going in the reverse. We are severely fragmenting that space. Today, there are 34 of the 43 major herds of the caribou in the circumpolar north are in decline due to Arctic warming and unprecedented resource development projects, including oil, gas, coal, and other minerals. Right now, I am actually finishing up editing an anthology of nearly 40 voices called Arctic Voices that will come out next spring. With that, one last thought that I wanted to share is the way I began saying about ecology, just like this collection here, is rooted in the seminal movement of the new topographics photographers who were working kind of hand in hand and a lot of back and forth conservation of the cultural geographers of their time, like Ifu Tuan or J.B. Jackson. Now we are at a different time, and there is a new field that has evolved over the last 2 decades and is expanding exponentially, called eco-criticism. And one of its founders is right here at your university, Cheryl Glotfelty, along with Larry Buell of Harvard University. They founded that field. It's expanded into a massive international thing now. And their biannual conference was this summer in June, and the title was Species, Space, and Imagination of the Global. And there I gave a keynote speech and met David Stettenfield. I'm trying to remember his last name. He's in the audience, and he teaches English here. And last night he asked me the question, how can we get eco-critical ideas into photography? With that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Subhankar. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Seattle-based artist and photographer Chris Jordan, who actually spent 10 years as a corporate lawyer before devoting himself full-time to photography. He's best known for his large-format digital works based on data about human consumption. His books include Intolerable Beauty, Portraits of American Mass Consumption, In Katrina's Wake, Portraits of Loss from an Unnatural Disaster, Running the Numbers, An American Self-Portrait, and Running the Numbers 2, Portraits of Global Mass Culture. Jordan has presented at the TED Conference and in 2008 traveled around the world in as an international eco-ambassador for National Geographic. And we were very fortunate here at the museum to host Chris's Running the Numbers exhibition just this past spring. So thank you for joining us. Welcome.
I keep seeing these dudes come and replace the water, but nobody takes a drink. So I'm going to honor these guys. I feel really honored and a little intimidated to be here in such amazing company, especially with only 15 minutes. I did something a little ambitious, and that was I went back about 20 years and pulled images, quite a few of which I've never exhibited publicly anywhere, and created a slideshow that if I had all the time I wanted would probably take about 2 hours. And I'm just going to pack it in here like a fax. So here we go. This is back from the early 1990s when I first began photographing what I thought of as urban landscapes. And what I was interested in at the time was kind of the collision of man and nature, of kind of natural processes happening in downtown Seattle, in Seattle's back alleys. And I made a whole series. I spent a couple of years doing this work, and I had a whole theory for why it was I was making these photographs and what they were about. That I did a lot of writing about. I never exhibited these or published any of that. But the reason that I wanted to show these to you now is because it was only years later when I began working with a therapist and began what has been a 12-year process of looking inward, that I realized that there was something going on unconsciously with me that I had no idea was happening at the time. And that was, I made all these photographs. Let's see, is there another one? Yeah. I made all of these in the years that I was practicing law, and at the time I was extremely lonely and felt very alienated. And I could never quite get why it was that I felt such a kinship, a sort of strange feeling of recognition to these alone, unnoticed things. And the reason I found that really interesting is because it made me realize that there's a whole process happening inside of me that is producing my work that I wasn't even aware of. And as I began kind of moving from downtown Seattle's alleys into the industrial areas of Seattle and making these photographs that sort of look like landscapes, here's these big spools are sort of put back together into looking like trees again. I began to see the infrastructure of our mass consumption. And as I began that study, I also started reading about our mass consumption and realized that there's something extremely deep going on culturally, underground, in the background, unconsciously, that commentators are talking about. And this is really what I'm interested in. I'm looking sort of outward as a photographer, outward into the world and making images, but what I'm really interested in is the causes of these things that happen inside of all of us. And one of my favorite metaphors for it is I have a close friend who's an Aikido master. And he says that whenever there's a physical conflict between two people, it happens energetically before it happens physically. And the Aikido master is interested in reading the energy before there's ever any physical contact. And he says, well, by the time the physical contact happens, by the time the punch is thrown and the block is made, that's all dust after the fact. And I'm interested in the altered landscape as dust after the fact. Like this is the result of something that's going on inside of every single one of us, inside our minds, inside our hearts, inside our spirits. And my belief is if humanity is going to turn the corner, if we're going to solve the catastrophic series of problems that we've got, it's not by looking over there and saving those things. It's going to be a kind of paradigm shift or a spiritual shift, however you would describe it, that has to happen inside the minds and the hearts and the spirits of every single one of us. So that's sort of what I'm trying to point toward with my work. This is a pile of sawdust in Tacoma, Washington, near a lumber mill that was so huge that it looked like one of those desert landscapes in a national park in Utah. This is another pile of sawdust. It was so huge that it had the geological features of a real mountain. It's got foothills and strata. You see this sort of strata as if there's been uplifting. I don't know how that happened, but then it has a summit. And this is the piece that's in the show here. It was an astonishing thing. I flew into New Orleans, and the reason I went there in I think it was 2004 or 2003, I was going to a place where they shred computers, which is about 50 miles north of New Orleans. So I flew into the New Orleans airport, and I rented a car, and I was driving over an overpass, and there in this big industrial area, I saw a Badland. I'm like, could that possibly be? And I spent hours walking around the perimeter till I finally found a place I could climb under a fence with my 8x10 camera and make this photograph. So not too long after that, I had the really sad experience of going to New Orleans and photographing after Hurricane Katrina. And the reason that, at least the ostensible, the reason that I was aware of that I did this work was when I started hearing about Katrina fatigue. Just a couple of months after the hurricane, everyone, and Katrina fatigue was this phenomenon. It wasn't the 130,000 people who lost everything they owned in Hurricane Katrina who were experiencing that fatigue. It was all the rest of us who were just sick of hearing about it. And Congress started talking about Katrina fatigue. And I hadn't yet seen any photographs that to me really captured something deeper about grief. And so I went down there with my camera and spent some time in New Orleans photographing the landscapes that I found there. Not long after that, I began the series that I call Running the Numbers, which is it's a conceptual project that sort of grew out of my frustration as a photographer that there's nowhere I could go and really capture the scale of our mass consumption. Because as I'd read about the hundreds of millions of cell phones that we throw out in the United States every year, or the 1.2 billion people in the world who lack access to safe drinking water, or just these astonishingly huge statistics about our mass culture and our mass consumption, I wanted, as a photographer, I wanted to go and take a picture of that. Like, where's the Mount Everest of our garbage that I can go stand in front of and behold with my senses and take a photograph? And of course, no such thing exists. All of these aspects of our mass culture, our mass consumption, are divided out over hundreds of thousands or millions of different locations. They're never all brought together in one place. And so these phenomena are actually invisible. And I think that's part of why we have a cultural disconnect from them, is because the only information we have to try to relate to these issues is these gigantic numbers, statistics. And it's no wonder that it's so hard for us to feel anything when we read a statistic like 2.3 million Americans in prison. We have the largest prison population of any country on earth. 2.3 million, that's a number that is magnitudes higher than any human has the ability to comprehend. And there are all these interesting sociological studies that prove that. It's this number that in my own experience, it doesn't go in one ear and out the other. It goes in one ear and just bounces right back out the same ear. It's like nothing registers in here when I see a number like that. And yet these statistics they characterize these profoundly important issues that I believe that we all need to be trying to comprehend if we're going to make that leap toward change. And so Running the Numbers sort of grew out of that. I decided what I would start doing is creating digital constructions that attempt to illustrate these statistics about our mass culture in a way that at least begins to point in the direction of comprehending them and maybe honoring some of the complexity involved in these issues. So this is Ansel Adams' famous photograph of Denali, and it's constructed out of 24,000 GMC Denali logos. you only have to change the word Denali. You just take the I at the end and move it in the middle, and you get denial. And so I took all the dark ones, I changed into denial, and the light ones I left Denali, and made this gigantic image. And this is the number of GMC Denalis that were being sold every 6 weeks back when SUVs were at their peak a few years back. So we're just sort of zooming closely up to this piece, and you can see all the Denali denial logos. Here's another image of 2 million plastic bottles. I photographed these up close and photographed the same bunch of bottles over and over and over and over until I had enough photographs to stitch together into a gigantic digital image of 2 million plastic bottles, which is 5 minutes of our plastic bottle consumption in the US. And there's a whole series of these, and I'm only showing you 2 because I've got other stuff I want to get to and have limited time. But what this one hopefully looks like is an image sort of looking out over an ocean. And speaking of the oceans, another project that I've been working on for several years now is taking photographs of the birds on Midway Island whose bodies are all filled up with plastic. And that is the subject of a whole conversation. But what I can tell you really briefly is Midway Island is it's in near the very middle of the Pacific Ocean, and it's this tiny postage stamp of an island. And if you measure it by the distance to the nearest continent, it's one of the remotest places on planet Earth, at least 2,000 miles from the nearest continent. And the nearest land to Midway Island is the Aleutian Islands, and it's 2,400 miles back to the US, more than 2,400 miles to Asia, and 5,000 miles or something like that on down to Australia. And yet, at this place that ought to be one of the most pristine environments on the planet, it's this absolutely horrific scene of tens of thousands of dead baby birds that cover the ground, and as their bodies decompose, you can see that they're all completely filled up with plastic. These are baby birds that had been fed that plastic by their parents, who fly out over the vast polluted Pacific Ocean, hopefully attempting to collect food to bring back to their babies, and they can't tell the difference between a squid and a cigarette lighter that's covered with fish eggs, and so they come back with their bodies filled up with plastic, and this is what it looks like. None of the plastic in any of these photographs was moved, arranged, manipulated at all. These are straight documentary photographs of the actual stomach contents of birds on one of the remotest marine sanctuaries on Earth. The reason that I do this work is it's very difficult to face these issues, and this is one of the things I'm interested in talking with Ed Burtynsky about, is what's the emotional process of facing the horrors of our times? How do we do that? That's what I'm interested in. I'm not so much interested in saving the albatross. I'm interested in looking inside those birds as like a mirror. That's us there. That's our spirits. That's our civilization. How do we face it as individuals? How do we experience our grief and our anguish for what's happening in the world? How do we allow that in and allow our heart to be broken open in a way that can be transformational? Because I believe grief is a portal into the deepest human experience. And what I'm trying to do with this work is to sort of test myself. Like, I want to find out if I can handle that much horror and that much grief. Like, how much reality does my heart have the ability to bear? Because if I want anybody else to bear the reality of our times and sort of show up in the present moment and really face what's happening, then I've got to be able to do it myself. And it's been a very difficult and challenging emotional, spiritual process. And yet, I believe that when we allow ourselves to feel our anguish, our grief, for what's happening to the world, then it can be a transformational process, because the only reason that we feel grief is because we care about something. If we don't care about it, then there's no feeling at all. And so I believe grief can be a portal, not to a kind of despair or shame or hopelessness or self-punishment. I believe it can be a portal into remembering our love for the sacred miracle that we've all been given, and for the sacred miracle that is the planet, our planet Earth. This is a series I'm going to go through quickly of images that, this is the first time I've ever showed these publicly. I made these on Midway Island. These are birds whose bodies are filled with plastic, who are weak and dying of dehydration and starvation, who following their instincts to go out to the sea, they attempt to fly off the beaches of Midway, and they're so weak that they crash into the water and they drown by the thousands out there, and then their bodies wash back up onto the beaches and create these what come across to me as these stunningly beautiful scenes. And I'm trying to bring together these two, sort of like bending the south end of the magnet and the north end of the magnet, the horror of it and the beauty of it together to where they touch, and you can't even tell the difference between those two things anymore. And the gestures that these birds make as the waves wash across their bodies are astonishing. Some of them are right at the water's edge, and as the waves come up, they move the bird. So this is a sequence. Each one had a wave in between. It's like it looked to me like a sort of surrender. This is a sequence of 9 of those images. I think that's the last one. It finally ended up looking like a flaming comet as it kind of just completely surrendered itself to the action of the waves. And the last thing I want to show you is just a couple of months ago, I was the recipient of the Prix Pictet Commission this year in Paris, and that project sent me on a trip to Kenya, where, among other things, I had the appalling privilege of standing over the dead carcasses of elephants that had been killed by poachers for their tusks. And so brace yourself. These are this is the first one we saw. The poachers have to move fast. The tusks are embedded deeply into the elephant's skull, kind of like our molars, and the rangers who work in these conservancy areas are instructed to shoot the poachers on sight. Poaching elephants is a crime punishable by death in Kenya, and the poachers know that. And so they have to work really fast. And so in this case, they were able to bring the elephant down and within a fairly short time. And as far as I could tell from the kind of thrashing and the amount of blood that was spattered, they began hacking the elephant's face off while it was still alive. There's its trunk that was lying a few feet away. This is its chest. Its head is to the left. This is a male bull elephant. Male elephants have nipples, like male humans. And I don't know why I was deeply touched by that, but I guess it just made me realize that we may have a common ancestor or something like that. There's the yin and yang of the extraordinary, miraculous, beautiful beauty of nature and man's kind of relentless destruction of it. I could go on a little further, but I think that's the last image I want to show you, and I'm really interested to get to the juice of the conversation, so let's call it good there and begin our panel discussion. Thank you.
We could just bring up the lights, thanks, and ask you 3 to join us on the sofa here. Thank you so much, all 3 of you, for just very different but powerful conversations. Your microphone should be turned on, and you each have one there. I do want to save time to open this up to dialogue from the audience also, but I thought maybe we just start with a question that I have for all of you. You all seem to be grappling in various and different ways with these large challenges facing these vast systems, whether it's extraction and production of resources to meet the demand of global consumption and global demand, and these vast, massive needs that humans apparently have. What do you feel is the role of your photography? What would you like the role of your photography to be? Do you have examples of how your photographs have helped to design solutions to these challenging kind of disparities that we see? And more broadly, what do you feel is the role of contemporary landscape photography in that dialogue? Any of you can take that on.
Well, I think one of the earliest things that I felt I was trying to do with my work and what photography did exceptionally well was to bridge a disconnect in that we live a life largely in cities and cars and jets and public transit, offices, homes, but we don't really see the even several hundred years ago, if you lived in a town, you probably know where most of the materials came from because they came from somewhere within the city limits, or just beyond the city limits. But now, we can get stone from China, we can get, things from all around the world. And so we live in this kind of bubble where we're not connected to either what's happening in the landscape and where the where the extraction's happening, or even where our things are coming from, where that extracted material goes to get reformed to come back to us. So in the still image, I think when you stand in front of a still image, and I kind of look at it in the museum setting where that's what I shoot for, is the large print, because you see a print differently on a wall than you do on a slideshow. The details, when you're using large format, you're also saying pay attention to that second reading of the smaller things that you see, or the things that tip off the scale, or the things that tell the story in a more compelling way. And I think that we register those kinds of places and absorb them differently as still images than we would, let's say, filmically or on a news program. The still image, I think, embeds itself in our memories. And to me, it's that when people start to see the aggregate of all of these images, they start, I don't have to tell them. They start by themselves saying something's amuck, something's not right, something's out of balance here. And it's interesting when you don't have to tell the person that these images in aggregate are going to tell a story about, in a way, our human overreach, our kind of dominant rogue species is running, around the planet and using up resources at an unprecedented rate in this last century. And what's happening is very much tied to human population growth. And I go back to the fact, when I was born 55 years ago, there was 2.5 billion people. Now we're at 7. That's almost a billion per decade. That's tripling the size in my life. So something's going on that's never happened before. And it's in our lifetime. It's right here and it's right now. So, how do we begin to wrap our both consciousness and arms around the problems that kind of population explosion brings to a finite planet like the Earth?
Subhankar, Chris, aside from framing problems, how would you like to, how do you feel, or how's your photography part of designing these solutions?
Well, I always shy away from answers. It's like, it's a question that I get frequently when I present my work. Someone always raises their hand and says, okay, I'm in, what do I do? Like, what should I do? And this is why I don't think of myself as being an activist, because I'm not really interested in in what's the answer, or what's the solution, or what should we do, other than look inward. Because I think the issues that were the sort of catastrophic issues that we're facing as a civilization right now, they are the result of a disconnect that has already happened inside of each one of us. And so I'm interested in photography as a kind of tool for introspection. And the only way that can happen is if we take a pause and look at what we feel when we see work like Ed's. Like, what's the feeling that happens? I think, that to me is the great power of art. It helps us remember our feelings, help us reconnect with what we feel. And when we get back to what we feel, then we're connected with a deep part of ourself, a deep part of ourself that might remember the things that we've forgotten about our priorities. How is it that we're making the choices collectively and as individuals, that we're making the choices that we're making? And I mean, right here in this conference, the irony is so thick you could walk across it. You know, I flew on a commercial jet from Seattle, and I'm staying in what may be the most god-awful casino I could have imagined if I hadn't walked in there myself. And to have this conversation, the irony is tremendous, and it's a hard thing to hold. And that's what I'm interested in, is like holding that irony, holding the paradoxes, and connecting with what we feel, even if those feelings are uncomfortable, if they're feelings of grief, or feelings of rage, or feelings of anger, or anxiety that come with facing the realities of the times that we live in. And that's I think, the great power of photography, and why I think this show, this exhibition, is such a landmark, because when you walk through it, you can't help but have some really deep feelings that lead somewhere, maybe.
That's pretty. It's hard to say something after that, but I'll try. I'm actually on the other side. I am an activist, like I said at the very beginning. So I work very closely with indigenous human rights organizations and environmental organizations, because as a photographer, there are multiple things, at least I'm hoping for. We all are hoping for something. One is, we all know we are going at an unprecedented rate, like I think, like the way you quoted Huxley, is this is happening. And it's not only happening right now, it's happening at a much rapid rate than even in the past. All this extraction, all our consumption. As an artist, if there is anything I'm trying to do, is to slow things down. And so to slow things down, there are multiple strategies I'm using for that. Even in the work, just how we see a work of art, how we produce a work of art, there is a whole process of slowing down. And I didn't talk about the desert project. There I was able to truly slow things down, because I could not speed up. It was my backyard. It was just 5 miles around my home. And what ended up happening, it redefined the desert for myself. And just to give an example, because it's very hard to talk quickly about project like that, is 90% of our state tree, pinon, in New Mexico, where I used to live, now I'm at Princeton, he died within just 5 years. 90% of a tree that has tremendous ecological significance that goes back to the beginning of Native American habitation in that entire southwest region. It did. But it didn't stop at death. Then I started looking at life beyond that, and it ended up being through that project that it's happening globally right now, the forest destruction. So going back to using photography, so back to the Arctic thing, is one of the things I've been attempting to do more than anything else, is to redefine how we think about the North. Like I said, we always think about the North, and not only the popular media perception, but also artists are very attracted to ice and snow and ice. And I resist that as much as I possibly can. I rarely photograph ice. Because there is so much more about that entire region of our planet that we never connected with, and now that has become where the gold rush is happening. Arctic is where the last remaining great resources of the planet seems to be, whether it's underneath the ocean or on the land. So slowing things down, so resistance is a means of slowing things down. That's where my activism comes in. But it's resistance that is rooted in the local, but local resistance cannot really succeed anymore. on the way scale of things are. Local resistance that is connected to international and national organization, rights organizations, and that's where most of my work is focused on. And photography is a medium, and then what ends up happening, like if you look at the work that is here and a lot of my larger bodies of work, is my photographs are very, very quiet. And people tell me that they're quiet, yet my words are very loud. And I try to combine the two.
Before we open it up for questions, I'm going to just ask one more. I'm very interested in whether any of you have any sort of powerful anecdotes about how your work has been received by all of the different audiences that encounter it, whether it's museums or the gallery system or scholars or politicians. Can any of you respond to sort of the way it's been received?
Sure. It's an interesting situation because for my thing, quite a few years, maybe a decade ago, curator at a prominent New York art museum told me that if you ever want your work to be shown in museums, start photographing the urban spaces and suburban spaces where human lives. And that's a very legitimate statement. Fortunately, I resisted that urge and kept on doing what I have been doing. And about reception, it's just, I think all of us, what it is, and I think Chris is articulating it the most, it comes from deep within. We are not going out to do this or out that. It's unless it comes from deep within, we are not going to be sincere about it or be passionate about it. And the reception, my work actually mostly straddles all of the spectrum from politics to art museums to art history. That one book cover I showed, that little polar bear picture, which could be in a National Geographic thing, but it isn't. An art historian picked that up and wrote a long essay that opened with that polar bear photo, and then the cover of the book, which is, the art history book goes back from 16th century American art to contemporary that was being discussed. So how, where work gets placed, I don't even care. Produce what comes from within and then see what happens. But it has had great impacts in the politics, for sure. That I can at least feel good about, that I work very closely with the political systems. You saw a very quick image of Barbara Boxer showing up one of my photos. She is the first woman ever to chair the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. She showed that polar bear photo on the Senate floor. And what ended up happening, you might not recognize that photo, but it is one of the most published image ever in the medium of the history of photography. It has been published more than 100,000 times now. Whenever there is an article on climate change, polar bear, resource extraction, from New York Times to a little newspaper in Timbuktu, that bear shows up. It's almost become anonymous. I've not made a cent out of that, but it is that image that shows up everywhere. But it looks like a natural history image. So from politics to art, I guess we all straddle all of these various boundaries. We don't produce this work with all of those things knowing beforehand. We produce what we care about.
Ed or Chris?
Yeah, I have an anecdote that it was, I showed my Midway photographs, the pictures of the birds filled up with plastic, at a girls' school in Brisbane, Australia. And it was an auditorium, it was about this many people. It was all girls in junior high age. And after we were done, after I had showed the photographs, I asked the girls to share what they were feeling. And one girl stood up and said, "I'm feeling really sad," and another said, "I'm feeling angry." And these were sort of what I was expecting. And after some of that sharing, at the end, their teacher stood up, and she was near the back of the room, and she said, "I'm just feeling panicked and really overwhelmed." And she started crying. And so did I. And the only thing I could think of to say right in that moment was, is anybody else feeling that right now? And all of the girls in the room raised their hands. And then I just said to the teacher, you're the person who had the courage to admit and acknowledge in the community, in your community, that you were feeling that. And it's really powerful medicine, you know, like facing the realities of our times. It's so easy to, like for me, it's like walking a tightrope, because it's so easy to fall into despair and hopelessness. After seeing Ed's work, just that barrage of incredibly powerful images, I felt overwhelmed and panicked. And that's something I think we all share right now. It's like I've heard various iterations of the quote, like, if you're not feeling overwhelmed and panicked, you aren't paying attention. And if we don't acknowledge that in community with each other, or if we don't acknowledge it to ourselves, then it stays underground, and it becomes that unconscious feeling that drives behaviors in a way that we're not even aware of. And I think a lot of what's going on in our country politically right now, you know, the Tea Party, I think there's a legitimate feeling that is being expressed by those guys that it's not being talked about publicly, but I relate to their feeling, the feeling of overwhelm and fear and anger and rage and kind of horror. But I wish we could start feeling that together and acknowledging it, and start a conversation that sort of accepts that, yeah, we're all overwhelmed and frightened right now. And let's start from there. And I can't even remember what the question was or anything, so I'll stop.
Then we'll ask.
Oh yeah, an anecdote.
How?
Well, I mean, I'm always interested in, I mean, I photograph, almost all my photographs are kind of a privileged access. In other words, I'm going into industry and negotiating, you know, to get past the barbed wire fence, or to get into the factories, or to get into those spaces. So it's a very direct, I'm quite always interested in terms of how they perceive what I'm doing, and then how the general public, you know, perceives what I'm doing. And then, but in terms of some of the anecdotes from industry, like I remember I did quarries, and quarries are pretty benign from the things that we do. We do things like, you know, gold mining is far worse, or copper mining is far worse in the kinds of effluents and pollutants that come off of it. But a quarry is quite benign. But I remember showing a whole bunch of work of my quarries, and I wanted to trade for a countertop. I was building a house in the country, and so I had all these quarry pictures, and it's the Rock of Ages quarry in Vermont, and I can remember, and they were, you know, at that time, you know, I was selling, you know, work in New York and in Toronto, and there was certainly an interest in the market for them, and so I was showing them the work, and I had the whole board of directors of Rock of Ages, and I get to the end of it, and they're all like, and they looked at me and said, who would be interested in this work, and why did you take these pictures? Like, they didn't understand, they couldn't comprehend what I was doing, and I said, well, you know, people seem to find them interesting, you know. I sell them, you know, and you know, it's not a typical, you know, when I did mines, people didn't think mines were works of art, or quarries, or for that matter, tire piles. But so I was saying, you know, well, you tell me. Like, there was such a silence, and I says, you tell me, like, what do you see? And it was so interesting. It was like, well, for us, this is like, you know, really sad. This is, you photographed most of the places where we've finished what was quarryable was finished. It was too fragmented. And then we have to pick up all our gear and go find more granite. And so this is the end of the line for us. So for us, this is like, you know, and I said, so that's why you don't like it? And they said, yeah. And I said, well, what about just the whole, you know, the structures that are left behind, the nature trying to push its way back through what you've done? And they go, doesn't do anything for me. So you know, to do the trade, I had to go and photograph the latest find with all their equipment, you know, in the photograph, and they were, you know, extremely pleased, you know, with that. And I got my countertops. So I've never showed that image, by the way. But what's interesting, though, with the images that I make, and what I find interesting, and this is more generally, is that I can show these images in Australia or Japan or China, and it is true that images are a universal language. I couldn't get an English text that described what was there and move across all those cultures, but the images move across those cultures and they get it. Generally speaking, you know, I find that the ones that see it very differently are the ones involved in the industries, have a different perception of it. But once you're kind of outside of that, I think in aggregate, when people see the work, they're left with an overwhelming, like, what are we doing? Like, what are we doing to the planet? And without me having to tell them, you know, or guide them through that the work itself, you know, gets them to that place. Rarely do I get somebody, you know, coming back and seeing a big exhibition of mine saying, wow, aren't we amazing humans? We can look at the stuff we do. You know, which, I mean, there is that reading in the work too. One can see the scale that we're operating on. Like, that is to someone might be seen as a, as a kind of a conquering of technology and science and all accumulating to us being able to be masters of the universe, so to speak. So, but it's mostly a kind of an overwhelming that happens. So I think, and it's interesting that photographs do have the capacity to cross boundaries.
Why don't we take hopefully 2 questions from the audience, but I'm getting the sign that we should maybe only take 1. Does anyone have any questions for the panel? How about right here? And I'm going to repeat your question, or if you want to, since you're so close, you can come up and use the mic.
I'll just project. When we look at your images, we see that, or we can read them in a way that suggests environmental problems are always a social issue, right? This is debatable. However, when we talk about social issues, we often talk about justice, and we can say that people are disproportionately affected by such things as recycling. I recycle to feel good about myself. The people recycling my e-waste are coming into contact with atrocious chemicals. So, do you see social justice as an entrance into talking about these problems in a different way?
Could everybody hear that question? Yeah. Okay. Does anybody have a response?
Well, I mean, I've seen things firsthand in that one of the toughest things I've ever seen is shipbreaking in Bangladesh. In terms of, it was like stepping back, you know, at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and maybe looking at the world as Dickens did in the Satanic Mills, and where the lifespan was 17 years. You know, but what was interesting is that here are these workers, you know, 25,000 of them, and they're taking down these ships that are products of the first world. And so these are large oil tankers, container ships, things of that nature. And the ones that they're breaking are 40, 45 years old, and they're full of crap. They're full of asbestos. They're full of, PCB oils. You know, they've got the worst that we've ever produced inside those ships. They are absolute, hazardous waste, on a scale that's pretty mind-numbing. And yet, somehow in social justice, and somehow we have been able to turn our heads and sell these ships, knowing that we're putting all those people in harm's way. They're breaking apart, these heater cores. And I rounded a corner once, and we were in a cloud. And I'm going, what is this? It's like a dust cloud. What is it? And we look, and there's like 10 guys pounding at this heat exchange core unit, the 10 foot by 10 foot with copper inside. And it was all asbestos in between. It was a cloud of asbestos. And we all just ran out, just ran out of the cloud and went, oh my God, this is a horrible, working environment. And yet we know what asbestos does. And so in terms of social justice, if we knew, we now know. We've lost our own in the process of learning about what asbestos does and what PCB oils do and all of that. And yet, there's nothing in our international laws that says, because we know it's harmful, it's okay if we let somebody else put them in harm's way. So where is the consciousness of democracies and developed countries when we allow that kind of tragedy to occur or the danger to occur to these people who don't know? And maybe there's some that do know there, but they're not willing to say, oh, we're going to do something about it. We're not going to give you a respirator or even, they didn't even have cutting goggles when they were, with torches, so they're burning out their eyes within 10 years of working, with torches without the proper goggles and stuff. So it is a kind of a shocking, I think of social justice, if there were, in a way, rules of engagement, and I think it goes back to our corporations and multinationals and what they're allowed to do and what we allow them to do. And there's a fantastic movie produced by some guys in Vancouver called The Corporation. But the corporation is given the rights of an individual. But yet if you put that corporation as an individual who can sign contracts and engage, if you put them on a couch and analyze them, they're a sociopath. They would be locked up. If you were a human being and had those rights and exercised them the way you did, you would be thrown in jail. So it's time to redraft, I think, the social contract corporations have with the rest of the world.
Do I have time?
Go ahead.
I guess one of the best thing that came out, I mean, what's happening in the environmental movement right now is coming from the social justice movement. And kind of it, I guess, started in Copenhagen with the UN conference, even though the climate change conference failed, but it gave birth to what we now call the climate justice movement. And I was there with one of my dear friends, whom I think I may have mentioned, Sarah James. She's a Gwich'in elder from Arctic Village. All those caribou hunting photos you saw. So Sarah and I were there that first day, and we were hopeful that something will come out of that. And in fact, Amy Goodman interviewed us the very first night we were there for Democracy Now! And then the conference just started fading away into something else where the indigenous people were not even allowed to enter the main Bella Center after like 3 or 4 days. So while that was going on, the counterculture movement was picking up its momentum, and that gave birth to the climate justice movement. But I want to say a couple of things in the Arctic that few American probably knows this, that the first true grassroots environmental movement in the US actually started in a small Inupiat village in Arctic Alaska called Point Hope. This small village with 2 scientists from University of Alaska and just a handful of conservationists stopped one of the greatest destructive project that was underway called Project Chariot, where the US government would have detonated 6 large nuclear bombs, causing a destruction far larger magnitude than Chernobyl on its own people and the habitat and the animals and everything. And this village stopped that. All that is written up in a fascinating book, which is actually optioned for a movie also by a dear friend, renowned historian, Dan O'Neill, called Firecracker Boys. Today, right now, the same community, and I work with them very closely, Point Hope is fighting the destruction of their entire ocean habitat where shale oil plans to drill for oil, all of it. And the US government is giving them, so far, the license to do so without any environmental impact statement, and knowingly that shale does not have any capacity, technology, or preparedness to clean up if there is any spill underneath the Arctic ice. So yes, so social justice movement is moving, and this is all coming also as talking about the ecocultural movement, that it's all melding now, that things are coming together. The environmental dialogue and the justice dialogue are melding right now. The artists are also all interdisciplinary, even though I work in photography, we all do, but multiple things are coming together, and that's kind of exciting. It's horrible, it's horrendous, but it's also kind of an opportunity for artists to engage in a new, interesting, exciting, multidisciplinary manner.
Chris, would you like to respond? Great.
I'll make it quick. I see the issues that would fall into the category of social justice issues and the issues that fall into the category of environmental issues as both being symptoms of the same kind of disconnect. You know, what would you call it? The sort of spiritual bankruptcy that we suffer from in the first world. And, you know, I believe that we're all enlightened spiritual beings. We're that way when we're born, and there are lots of places around the world where you can go and find adults who have that aspect of them intact. The indigenous cultures of the world, like some of them at least, place a very high priority on maintaining that about themselves. And we just lose that in the rushing around and the kind of strangeness of our civilization. It gets like the deep wisdom that we all carry, our compassion for other people, the deep knowledge that we all have, that we have been birthed from the earth and that we're dependent on it, that we're intimately connected with it. Like I think we all have that. It just gets covered over with the fears and the greeds and the rushing arounds. And I think it's so interesting and I think really important right now to begin to unpack that, to look in and see if we can reconnect with that deeper part of ourselves. And that's why I think grief is so important. It's like a portal that goes there.
Please join me in thanking all of our panelists.